Welcome back to the deep dive. This time, we're tackling a subject that's always in the news but rarely understood. How politicians use communication to shape what people think. You shared some excerpts from a French communication website. Um, wow, comme c'est beau. And I have to say, some of this stuff is surprisingly insightful. So, we're going to unpack how politicians blend rhetoric, traditional media, and of course, social media to influence public opinion, and ultimately, elections.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we often think of political communication as just speeches, but it's so much more nuanced than that.
So it's not just about standing at a podium and giving a rousing speech. What else is going on behind the scenes?
Well, think of it as a carefully crafted strategy with many moving parts. You've got the speeches and debates,
Yeah.
but also the subtle art of media relations. Then layer in the constant stream of advertising, the strategic use of social media, and sometimes, let's be honest, a bit of spin.
It sounds almost like a performance, with politicians constantly trying to manage their image and message across all these different channels. But where does it all begin? What's the foundation of effective political communication?
Well, the real magic. The bedrock of it all is rhetoric, the art of persuasion. Politicians throughout history have used it to connect with audiences, build support, and ultimately win over voters.
I remember studying rhetoric in school, but to be honest, it seemed pretty theoretical back then. How does it actually play out in the real world of politics?
Think about it this way. Every time a politician speaks, they're not just delivering information, they're trying to persuade you to see the world through their lens. And they do this by carefully balancing three key elements: ethos, pathos, and logos.
Okay, those terms sound familiar, but refresh my memory. What do they actually mean in the context of, say, an election campaign?
Let's start with ethos, which is all about credibility. Politicians need to convince you that they are trustworthy, knowledgeable, and have your best interest at heart. A great example is a candidate who emphasizes their years of experience in public service or their deep commitment to a particular cause. They're essentially saying, trust me, I know what I'm doing, and I'm on your side.
So it's about projecting an image of competence and trustworthiness. But wouldn't relying too heavily on ethos make them sound, well, a bit arrogant?
That's the balancing act. Too much emphasis on ethos can backfire and make them seem out of touch. Now, let's talk about pathos, the appeal to emotion. Think about those campaign ads that feature heartwarming stories of everyday people struggling with healthcare costs, or those speeches that evoke a sense of hope for the future. They're tapping into your emotions, trying to make you feel a personal connection with their message.
It seems like pathos would be especially powerful in today's world, where people are constantly bombarded with information and looking for something genuine to connect with. But what about the facts? Where does logic fit into all of this?
That's where logos comes in, the appeal to reason. Politicians use statistics, research findings, and expert opinions to back up their claims and convince voters that their policies are sound and effective.
So it's not just about pulling at your heartstrings. They also need to appeal to your head. It sounds like a successful politician needs to be a master of all three: ethos, pathos, and logos, weaving them together to create a truly persuasive message. But let's zoom out a bit. How does the media landscape, beyond the individual politician, influence all of this?
Even in the age of social media, traditional media outlets like television,
Right.
radio, and newspapers still play a huge role in shaping political discourse and, by extension, public opinion.
I can see how they still be relevant. But honestly, with so much information online, it's hard to imagine that traditional media has the same power it once did. How do they still manage to influence the way we think about politics?
One way is through agenda setting. They decide what issues get covered and how prominently they're featured. By spotlighting certain topics and downplaying others, they subtly shape what the public perceives as important, influencing which issues voters prioritize when making their decisions.
So it's not just about telling us what to think, it's about telling us what to think about. What other tricks do they have up their sleeve?
Well, there's framing, how a story is presented. The same event can be portrayed very differently depending on the angle, the choice of words, and the sources they choose to highlight. For example, an economic policy can be framed as a success story that's boosting jobs, or a failure that's hurting families.
That's a great point. It's all about the spin, isn't it? They can take the same set of facts and present them in a way that supports their narrative. Is there anything else we should be aware of?
One more to consider is priming.
Yeah.
If you're repeatedly exposed to stories about, say, crime or immigration, you might start to view those issues as more urgent or important, even if other things are objectively more pressing.
So it's not just about what they tell us, it's also about what they don't tell us, and how they frame the information they choose to share. This is making me think a lot more critically about the news I consume.
That's the goal. But we can't talk about political communication these days without addressing the elephant in the room: social media.
It's almost impossible to imagine a modern political campaign without a strong social media presence. Why has it become such a game changer?
Firstly, the speed and reach are unparalleled. A message can go viral in an instant, reaching a massive audience much faster than any traditional media outlet ever could. Think of those controversial tweets or campaign videos that dominate your feed. They spread like wildfire.
It's incredible how quickly information, or misinformation, can travel online. But isn't it harder to control the narrative on social media since anyone can share their opinion?
That's true. But politicians and campaigns have become very sophisticated in their use of social media. They leverage platforms like Twitter and Facebook to micro-target specific demographics and tailor their messages to appeal to specific groups. They leverage platforms like Twitter and Facebook to micro-target specific demographics and tailor their messages to appeal to specific groups.
So it's almost like they're creating these hyper-personalized campaigns, feeding different messages to different people based on their interests and beliefs. That's both fascinating and a bit unsettling, isn't it?
It certainly raises some interesting questions about how we consume information in the digital age. And social media also allows for a level of direct engagement. That was unimaginable just a few years ago. Politicians can now interact with voters in real time, answering questions, responding to criticism, and even participating in online debates.
I've noticed that more and more politicians are using social media to seem relatable, even showing behind-the-scenes glimpses into their lives. Do you think this kind of authenticity resonates with voters?
It can, especially with younger generations who are used to this constant stream of information and personal connection. But of course, there's a potential downside to all of this. Social media can also be a breeding ground for propaganda and spin, making it even harder to distinguish fact from fiction.
That's a great point. I think we all feel that sense of information overload sometimes. It's like we're drowning in a sea of headlines, tweets, and sound bites, and it's hard to know what to believe. But before we get lost in the weeds, can we go back to something you mentioned earlier? How do we actually measure the impact of all this political communication on public opinion? Does it actually work?
That's a question researchers have been grappling with for decades, and there's no easy answer. The impact can be subtle and complex, often a mix of short-term and long-term effects.
So how do we know if a campaign's message is actually getting through and influencing people's opinions?
Well, one way is to look at changes in public opinion polls over time. If you see a significant shift in how people view a particular issue or candidate after a major campaign event or media blitz, it's a pretty good indication that the communication had an impact.
Makes sense. But isn't it hard to isolate the specific impact of a single message or event, especially with so many other factors at play?
Absolutely. It's like trying to untangle a giant knot. Researchers use various methods to try and isolate the effects, like controlled experiments and sophisticated statistical analysis.
I imagine it's like a giant puzzle, trying to piece together all the different factors that contribute to a shift in public opinion. What other methods do they use?
They also use focus groups and in-depth interviews to get a more nuanced understanding of how people are processing information and forming their opinions.
So it's not just about numbers and statistics. It's also about understanding the human side of it, the psychology of persuasion. This is all so fascinating, but I have to admit, it can feel a bit overwhelming. How do we, as everyday citizens, navigate this complex world of political communication?
The key is to become more conscious and critical consumers of information. We need to develop a sort of political communication literacy to filter through all the noise and make informed decisions.
That sounds like a tall order. Where do we even begin?
First, be aware of your own biases. We all have them, and they can unconsciously influence how we interpret information.
I'm sure I have some blind spots I'm not even aware of. How do I even start recognizing my own biases?
It takes conscious effort. Think about the news sources you gravitate towards. Are they all leaning in one direction? Make an effort to expose yourself to diverse viewpoints, even those that challenge your preconceived notions.
That's a great point. I tend to stick to the same few news outlets, so I'm probably missing out on a lot of different perspectives. What else can we do to become more savvy consumers of political information?
Pay close attention to the language being used. Politicians and media outlets often use emotionally charged words and persuasive rhetoric to sway opinions.
It's like they're trying to manipulate us with their words.
Not necessarily manipulate, but they're definitely using language strategically to frame an issue or paint a particular picture. Learn to recognize these techniques, and don't be afraid to ask yourself, Why are they using this specific language? What are they trying to convey?
So it's like we need to become word detectives, carefully analyzing the language for clues about the speaker's intentions. This is really making me think differently about how I consume news. What else can we do?
Don't just take things at face value. Fact-check information, especially things you see on social media. There are plenty of reputable fact-checking websites that can help you separate truth from fiction.
That's good advice, especially in the age of fake news and misinformation. It's like we have to be our own editors, filtering the information before we internalize it.
Exactly. And finally, don't be afraid to question everything. Healthy skepticism is a valuable tool in navigating the world of political communication. Just because someone sounds confident or authoritative doesn't mean they're telling the whole story.
It sounds like you're saying we need to be active participants in the process, not just passive recipients of information. We have to engage critically with what we're hearing and seeing, and not be afraid to challenge the status quo.
You've got it. Informed citizens are the cornerstone of a healthy democracy.
I love that. So it's not just about being informed, it's about being engaged and willing to think critically about the information we're consuming. This has been incredibly eye-opening. But I want to bring it back to something we talked about earlier, real-world examples. Can we explore some specific cases where political communication played a pivotal role?
Absolutely. A classic example of a well-executed campaign is Barack Obama's Yes We Can campaign in 2008. It masterfully blended rhetoric, traditional media, and the emerging power of social media to create a message of hope and change that resonated with millions of voters.
I remember feeling so inspired by that campaign. It felt like a movement, a collective energy that transcended traditional politics.
That's the power of effective communication. They tapped into a deep yearning for something different and used every tool at their disposal to connect with voters on an emotional level.
That's a great example. What other examples come to mind?
Let's consider how political communication operates during times of crisis. Think of how leaders communicate during natural disasters or pandemics. Clear, consistent, and empathetic communication is crucial to maintaining public trust and guiding people through difficult times.
It makes sense that people would look to their leaders for reassurance and guidance in those situations. How a leader communicates can have a huge impact on public morale and even on how people respond to the crisis itself. Are there any examples that stand out?
Think back to the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. Leaders who communicated clearly, honestly, and empathetically tended to be more successful in guiding their citizens through the uncertainty and fear. On the other hand, those who downplayed the risks, spread misinformation, or appeared to be out of touch often faced backlash and a loss of public trust.
That's a powerful example of how political communication can have real-world consequences, affecting people's lives in very tangible ways. What about social movements? How do they leverage communication to achieve their goals?
Movements like Black Lives Matter and #MeToo have demonstrated how social media can be a powerful tool for amplifying voices, raising awareness, and mobilizing support around social justice issues.
It's amazing to see how these movements have harnessed the power of online platforms to spread their messages, organize protests, and challenge systemic injustices.
They've shown that effective communication can be a catalyst for social change, driving important conversations and demanding accountability from those in power.
It's inspiring to see how people are using communication to fight for what they believe in and to hold those in power accountable. It all comes back to that idea of informed and engaged citizenship. It really highlights how crucial it is to understand these dynamics of political communication,
Yeah.
both for those shaping the messages and for us, the audience, trying to decipher the...
It's a two-way street, absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I think it's worth revisiting those key takeaways. We've seen how political communication goes far beyond just speeches. It's this intricate web of strategies woven through traditional media, amplified by the immediacy of social media, and always underpinned by the art of rhetoric.
It's like we've been given a peek behind the curtain, seeing the gears turning, and understanding how those messages are crafted and disseminated to influence our opinions and ultimately our actions.
And hopefully, what you've gained from this deep dive is a sense of empowerment. The more we understand the tools and techniques of political communication, the better equipped we are to analyze those messages critically, to question the narratives being presented, and to form our own informed opinions.
So it's not about becoming cynical or tuning out completely. It's about engaging with this information landscape in a more conscious and informed way.
Exactly. We need to be active participants in the process, not passive recipients of whatever messages are thrown our way. It's about asking questions, challenging assumptions, and seeking out diverse perspectives to get a fuller picture of the issues at hand.
It's like we've been given a decoder ring to decipher the language of politics, to understand the strategies at play,
Yeah.
and to see through the spin.
I like that analogy. And ultimately, it's about recognizing that political communication is a powerful force, one that can be used for good or for ill. It's up to us, as informed citizens, to ensure that it's used responsibly and ethically to promote dialogue, understanding, and positive change.
That's a great point to end on. So the next time you encounter a political message, whether it's a powerful speech, a carefully curated social media post, or even a seemingly objective news article, remember what we've discussed today.
Take a moment to pause and consider who is trying to persuade you, what techniques they're using, and most importantly, what their agenda might be.
By engaging in that critical thinking process, by becoming more aware of the forces at play, we can all be more informed and engaged citizens, capable of making thoughtful decisions about the issues that matter most to us.
It's been a pleasure sharing these insights with you and with our listeners. Remember, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about how political communication works, the more empowered we become as individuals and as a society.
And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating world of political communication, to question the messages you encounter, and to use your newfound knowledge to engage in meaningful discussions and to make informed decisions about the future you want to create.
Stay curious and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
That's a wrap on this deep dive into political communication. Thanks for joining us. And remember, there's always more to explore. So stay tuned for our next deep dive into a new and fascinating topic.